we want to collect all the functions that we want to animate onto a control object. So when it comes to animating this thing, all we need to do is grab this control object and everything we need is on that thing. My control object is just going to be a circle spline that I've created, and I want this sitting flat on the ground plane. So I've created the circle. I'm just going to go into its object attributes and change the plane that it's sitting on to ZX or XZ, which means it's just sitting on the ground. Now the reason that I'm using a circle is because it's something I can see easily in the scene, but it doesn't render. Splines on their own, when you hit a render button to render off your scene, they don't render unless you put an extrude or something like that on it. So this is going to be basically an invisible object. And I'm just going to change its radius so it's a bit bigger, so it's really easy to select. And I'm going to rename this serial control. And I'm going to change my cube to serial box, because you always want to be naming your stuff. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to parent my serial box onto the serial control. So I'm just going to drag and drop it onto here. So this means when I'm animating, when I want to animate my serial box jumping around, I'm not going to grab the box, I'm going to grab this control object. So that's the thing I'm going to grab, and I'm going to animate it hopping around. So that's really important. So the next thing I want to do is I want to set up some controls on this circle so that when I select it, on here somewhere, I've got a twist, bend, squash and stretch function set up really easy to find and easy to animate. So this is where we're going to use Xpresso, which is Cinema 4D's visual programming system. It sounds a little scary, it's not too scary. What we're going to do, all we're going to do is we're going to collect the twist angle, the squash and stretch factor, and the bend angle, or the bend strength, sorry. All we're going to do is we're going to collect those three functions and store them somewhere that we can access really easily. So I'm going to select my serial control, and I'm going to add some Xpresso to it, some of this visual programming. So that's a tag. So in Cinema 4D, all of our extra functions and effects are stored in tags. So if I go to Cinema 4D tags, I want an Xpresso tag. So once we create an Xpresso tag, the editor for Xpresso will jump up, and this is a little, it's like a flowchart editor where we drop in different functions and we wire them all together.
It's not
Xpresso. Okay, so the next thing that we want to do is we're building some custom controls here. We're collecting some stuff, and we're, as I said, we're storing it in a place that's easy for us to access. So what we're going to do is we're going to create some of our own custom attributes down the bottom in this attributes area, and that stuff is called user data. It's stuff that we make. We're the users, we're making some data. So make sure you've got your serial control circle selected. Go down to user data, and we're going to add some user data. Okay, we're going to add some twist controls. So, under the name for this user data, I'm going to call it twist. Twist is, I think it's an angle. So, under data type, I'm going to change it to I'm going to change it to what's called a float value, which is a number that can go up and down in either direction. And under units, it's going to be degrees, because we're dealing with the twist angle. And I'm going to turn off the limiting, so I'm not going to limit any of this. So we're creating our own little bit of data called twist. It's a twist function. It's a float number, which is just a number that can go up and down, and it's in degrees. And I'm going to hit OK. So once we've created that little bit of user data, if I select my serial box control circle now, I've got this extra tab on here called user data, and here is my twist value. Okay, so all we're doing here with this user data is we're going to collect this twist angle, this squash and stretch factor, and this bend strength we're going to collect them all in one place so they're quick and easy to select and animate. That's all we're doing. We're not actually making anything new, we're just putting them somewhere that it's easy to get them to. It's like, kind of like making bookmarks. Okay, so I've got one bit of user data, which is for my twist. The next thing I want to do is this factor for my squash and stretch. Now this is a percentage value, so I'm going to put this as a percentage value in my user data. So let's create the user data again. So user data, add user data. This is going to be squash and stretch. Again, it's a float, which is just a float is a number that can go up and down. It's in percent, which is what I want, and I'm going to turn off the limits for it so I can have any value, and that's about it. So all I've done is I've just named it, made sure it's a float, and it's in percent, hit OK. So there's my squash and stretch value there. The last one I want to add in here is bend, and this is bend strength, and again it's in degrees. So let's go back to my serial control circle, add some more user data, and this is going to be bend. It's a float value. It's in a was it percent? No, it's degrees. It was degrees, and I'm not going to limit it. Okay. So as I said before, all we're doing here is we're taking the things that we want to animate, this angle, this factor, and this angle here, and we're just collecting those functions in one place so we don't have to keep hunting through our deformers every time we want to do this. So that's our user data created, and that's all created on our control object. So now when we come to animate, we can select our control object, we can move it around to animate our box, and we'll be able to set our squash, stretch and bend from these values here. At the moment they don't do anything because we haven't actually connected them, we haven't told them to do anything. All we've done is said make these three values. So this is where the Xpresso comes in. With Xpresso, all we're going to do is we're going to connect these controls that we've made to the things that we actually want to control. So how do we do that? I've got my Xpresso editor. If yours has disappeared, just double click the little Xpresso tag and it'll pop up. And what we're just going to do is literally just going to connect things by joining values together. So the stuff that we want to build up in here, we want our twist deformer. So I'm just going to drag and drop this twist deformer into the Xpresso editor. I'm going to drag and drop the squash and stretch deformer into here and the bend deformer. So our Xpresso editor is just showing us a different representation of these functions here. And what we do is we get these little boxes, we can resize them if we want to, so they're easier to see and we can read the titles on them. And the other thing I want to do is I'm going to drag and drop my serial control into Xpresso as well. So in our Xpresso editor, we've got the three deformers, we've just dragged and dropped them, and our serial box control. Now, what I want to do is, I'm going to, in this Xpresso editor, we can just click and drag these boxes and move them around. I'm going to put my deformers over on the right-hand side, and my serial control on the left. Now, there's a reason for this. What this Xpresso editor is doing is it's giving us access to all these different attributes for all these different objects, and it's going to allow us to create lines to connect those functions together. Now, in Xpresso, on the left-hand side of any object that we've got in here, we've got this sort of slightly bluish, purplish kind of square, and we've got an orangey, what is that, orangey reddish kind of color on the other side. So one side on the left is input, and the other side is output. Okay, if I click in this little coloured square on my serial control, it will show me every single attribute that my serial control has. So it's showing me all of these functions down here, plus a bunch of other ones. If you click on this little coloured square next to serial control, if you look right down at the bottom of the list, there's some user data. And in there is the three things that we've just made, the bend, squash, and twist. Now I'm going to click on each of those one in turn. And when we click on them, it's adding them into our control box here so that we can actually access them. Now I've done mine in the order bend, squash, and twist. So I'm just going to reposition my little squares that I've got for my deformers alongside it so that they're in the same order. Bend, squash, and twist. Bend, squash, and twist. Okay, let's start with our bend object. If we have a look at our bend deformer, the thing that we want to animate is called the bend strength. So if I come back to Xpresso editor and click on this little coloured square, I want to look for the attribute that's called bend strength. So if I have a hunt through all these menus here, somewhere in here is going to be a strength value. And here it is here. It's under Object Properties, Strength. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to click and drag from the bend on my control to the bend strength on my deformer. And if you click and drag from one circle to the next, it'll create a little line. So what this is saying is that bend attribute that we made down here, it is controlling the bend deformer's strength. And I can test that out. If I go to my serial control and go to bend, now when I adjust it, it is controlling that deformer. Okay, so I'm going to do the same thing for my other two deformers. If I go to squash and strength, the thing that makes the squash and stretch is called this factor. So when I adjust the factor, it squashes and stretches. So in Xpresso, if I hunt down through here, somewhere in here is the factor. Here it is under Object Properties. And now I'm going to click and drag from one circle to the next. So now squash and stretch is controlling factor. One thing you'll notice is that your screen's freaked out and gone all black.
Oh, my face just completely disappeared.
Yep. So what has probably happened, if you go back to your serial control object, is squash and stretch is at 0%, which means your object has been squashed infinitely across your 3D world. So if we just set that back to 100%, that should be all good. Because remember that factor value that we adjust for squash and stretch? 100% is no squash or stretch. Below 100 is squash, above it is stretch. So if we go back here now and drag this, excellent, that's working. So the last thing I want to do, let's just set that back to 100, is for my bend deformer, sorry, not my bend, my twist deformer, the twist angle is what I want to control. So let's go to Xpresso and find the angle. It's probably under Object Properties. There it is. I can click and drag these together, and now my twist angle should be connected. Okay, so that's all working. So what I've done with this Xpresso tab is I've just collected together those three functions that I want to animate. I've collected them as user data, and now I've used an Xpresso tag so that these bits of user data will actually control those attributes on each of those deformers. The good thing is now they're all collected in one place. Those three things I want to animate, they're all right here. They're easy to select. I can animate them really fast, and I'm not constantly selecting different objects and hunting through them. So it might seem this is a little overly complex just for wanting to bend, twist, and squash an object, but it's going to mean that we can animate much faster if the things we want to animate are all collected in one place. And that's what a control object is for. It collects all the animation functions in one place so that it's really easy to animate. Control objects can be fairly simple like this, or they can be really complex and have all sorts of other functions built into them. But the important thing is we